It's Tom Robinson on BBC Six Music with Glad to be Grey, and our next guest is financial expert and wealth management advisor Jonathan Davis.
Hi, Tom.
I wanted to talk to you about the kind of practicalities for people of my generation who grew up in the 60s and who are now hitting our 60s, and retirement age is kind of looming on the horizon. But frankly, working as freelancers in this business, in the creative arts and one thing and another, to be honest, we don't have company pensions. We haven't put money aside. We're looking with increasing terror at the prospects of the next 10 and 20 years. Now, anytime you go and talk to a pensions advisor, and I've been to a few, they all talk to me about stuff I don't understand. They talk about ISAs and PEPs and annuities, and it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. I wondered if you could kind of try and help me see the wood for the trees.
I will try and do that. I'll come back to PEPs and ISAs in a moment. I think the thing that the grey age group has come to believe through history, I guess, not unnaturally, is that you can't lose with property. And that's where the bulk of the greys have put the money. And the fact is, of course, for 30 years until recently, they've been proved absolutely correct. The problem is they still believe it. And nothing goes in a straight line, and everyone's made the money that's going to be made in property. And we are absolutely convinced that it's in retreat now for years, if not decades. The good times have been. And that's what the people in the 60s need to realise. There isn't one sure way of making money. So you say about PEPs and ISAs, tax-free or tax-efficient savings plans, pensions, tax-efficient, venture capital trusts, enterprise investment schemes.
Oh, my mind's boggling already.
Of course you're confused. All I say to you is that you need to preserve capital first and foremost, because for the last couple of years and for the next few or maybe several years, as far as we're concerned, we're in deflationary times. What does that mean? It means that assets, such as property we've just talked about, stocks and shares, prices even generally, they're going to fall. They're in the doldrums. And in deflationary times, you have to hold on to what you have. You should also take advantage of all your tax reliefs. I don't know why people are so hung up negatively on pensions. A pension is a brilliant tax-efficient savings plan. If you're a high-rate taxpayer, if you're earning up to £100,000 a year, you get 50 pence back for every pound you put in. Why wouldn't you do it? So that's not true. 40 pence back. You get 40 pence back. So in other words, you put 60 pence in, you got £1 in there. And up to £100,000 earnings, you can put practically up to £100,000 in. You might be limited on the total you can have in your pension, a couple of £1 million, but you can put 100,000. So in other words, you can get £40,000 tax relief.
So somebody in my position just hitting 60, not much in the way of savings, it is still worth trying to start a pension scheme at this point.
I would absolutely agree with that. If you continue to be a high earner and you have surplus cash, then put it into your pension as a lump sum. You don't have to do it next year. Do it this year. As I say, up to £100,000 earnings, you can put £60,000 in, and the government will put £40,000 in for you.
Now, can I ask you a question about pensions? Because this is the thing that has been worrying me sick, and I don't know anything about this, to be honest, and my head swims as soon as people start talking about these subjects. But as I understand it, when your pension matures, you have to buy something called an annuity, and you have to accept the prevailing interest rate at the time that you take the annuity, and that's your income for life. And at the moment, interest rates are 0.5%, and if I take an annuity retiring at 60, I'll see almost nothing for my big pot of money.
And that is a natural concern from lots of retirees, and I get it all the time. Let's give an example. Let's say you come to retirement and you have saved some money there, and you've been a reasonable earner. Say you've got £200,000 in your pot. Firstly, as I said, you can take 25% of it as a tax-free cash lump sum. £50,000 in your bank account. Thank you very much. There's now 150,000 in the pot. And what you say is, it's a bit tabloidish, but I can see in your face it's what you actually are a bit unsure about yourself. What do you have to do with that £150,000? Note that it is only 75% of what we were talking about, so it's not the whole pot. First of all, you do not have to buy an annuity until you get to 75. Now, what does that mean? It means that if you're still earning, you just let the pension ride until your 70s. You've had your tax-free cash lump sum if you wanted it. It was tax-free cash. Why not? And you let it ride within the pension fund. And if the pension fund is growing, remember, it's growing tax efficiently. There's very little tax on a pension fund. Eventually, when you get to 75, and come on, most people are going to need an income in their 70s and beyond. It may well be appropriate, in fact, to buy an annuity. Even though annuity rates are rubbish right now, and even if they are low, you're in your 70s. Annuity rates are partly based on mortality. In other words, when are you likely to die? And of course, if you're in your 70s, you're that bit closer to it, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Thus, the pensions company is going to give you a higher annuity rate. And for a 70-something-year-old, even with a spouse, so, if God forbid something happens to you, then the spouse continues to receive an income, you're looking at several percent per annum. So from £150,000 a year, you could be looking at £10,000, £12,000, £13,000 a year, which isn't a disaster. And the alternative to buying an annuity in your 60s, if you do want to have an income from your pension, is you go into a thing called, we generally call it drawdown. It's an easy phrase. You literally keep the money invested in the pension and you draw an income each year from the pension between 0 and roughly several percent of the pension. It changes each year. In other words, you have flexibility in how you draw that pension. You've not bought an annuity. The pension fund remains invested. You have flexibility. I'll tell you one thing that is a particular use to a lot of retirees. What happens if you draw on your pension and you die? What happens to your spouse? Or I've talked about there, well, you can build in what's called a spouse's pension. So you start off with a slightly smaller pension and your spouse receives an ongoing income if you die. But what if you haven't taken your pension yet? What happens to the fund? Do you know what? The fund is paid out as a tax-free cash lump sum to whoever you have previously stated it should go to. There's very little reason why you or your spouse should lose the pension fund.
So that's a strong argument in favour of taking
and on
out a
top
pension.
of that, you've got all the tax reliefs. Absolutely.
But then you mentioned that after possibly several or perhaps a few years, you envisage rampant inflation coming in. Now, that surely is going to devastate your $15,000 a year that you're hoping to live on for your retirement.
In which case, the annuity type that you would start off with would be an index-linked one. And certainly, whereas a flat pension until you die is, for example, £12,000 a year, it would more likely start off at £8,000 or £9,000 a year. Significantly less, however, index-linked. And if we're right, if a few years from now we start moving to higher inflation, and I should say, I'm expecting 5 or 6% inflation in 5 years' time. I'm expecting much lower than that going forward from now till then, and then it will pick up again. But by the end of the decade, yes, I'm expecting 1970s style inflation. So what we have right now, this very second, May 2010, is, I think, transitory. It relates to what's happened in the last year. I think over the next couple of years, we're going to see falling prices. Then we'll start to get a move to increasing inflation. And then by the end of the decade, yes, I think we will see superinflation.
So we need to guard against that?
Yes, there will come a time when my own firm, in investing advice, we will move our benchmark objective from preserving capital to preserving purchasing power. And that's when you need to beat inflation. And that's what we will do in a few years' time.
Now, let's just take the scenario for somebody who's not in a fortunate position, but who's actually been struggling. Say somebody who's been a musician, a drummer, or a draftsman, somebody who works in the creative arts, but hasn't managed to get a big regular income and who's having to make some sort of provision in very turbulent times now. How should somebody set about trying to make provision for themselves with what little money they can get on an irregular basis?
Yeah. The first thing they absolutely should do is secure work, secure income. And I would say more important than financial products is networking. When people go freelance, it means normally that they've been employed previously. And when you're employed, you get given work to do. And at the end of the month, you get your paycheck. When you go freelance, you don't get given work unless you're extremely lucky. And in this hard world, luck is something which isn't very easy to come by. So networking, I think, is the most financially useful thing you can do. You got to get out shaking hands with people, schmoozing with them, telling them what you can do and how you can help them. And it's amazing how if they can't necessarily help you, they know a man who can. They know a person who could use your services. And the more you're out networking, because, between jobs, you've got downtime. And if you're only lazing in the garden, you're not helping your business. And you have to think about freelancing as a business. In downtime, that's when you should be out glad handing and getting people to know who you are, getting your name in front of them, so that when they next need someone to do your particular skill, you're the name in the frame. So that's the most important thing that I would say. In terms of financial issues, financial planning issues, there will be tax to pay. And it's amazing how it just suddenly comes up. Well, it does. And you know what? It comes up every year. And if you've been earning, you will have to pay tax. And the most basic thing, and everyone talks about it, is put money aside. But I have seen so many people who simply don't do it. And I would suggest that not only do you put aside roughly a quarter of whatever earnings you received into a bank account that you will not touch, not only do you do that, but I would also build up a 6-month spending emergency reserve. In other words, when you're receiving your income for your first jobs, don't just blow it. Don't just spend it. Don't just buy new equipment, because it's not just the equipment that's going to take you forward. You have to keep going. You have to stay in business, and you don't want the revenue and customs knocking on your door. So don't do what other people do and get into the habit of always going into overdraft. You get your money, you spend it, and then until the next job comes, I'll just take an overdraft. It's an extremely expensive way of developing your business. Instead, put money in a bank account, even if it's only getting 1 or 2%. Doesn't matter, it's there. And you will use it not only to pay the tax, which will come up in about a year and a half's time, but it will also be there for the downtime. So the 6-month emergency reserve you will be so glad you've done it. And then after you've done all that, then start planning for the future. I go back to something I said earlier. Don't put all your money into property. Not for, I would say, another 2 or 3 years. I mean, I'll put some figures on that. We're expecting a 30% fall in property over the next 2 or 3 or 4 years.
Would you actually recommend people to sell their property?
I have never recommended anyone to sell their family home. I certainly have recommended people to divest of excess property, and I continue to recommend that. I would also recommend that people be absolutely able, put in place facilities so that they're absolutely able to pay debt if ever they need to. In other words, people think mortgage isn't a debt. Well, it's a massive debt. And I've been in financial services for long enough to remember the early 1980s when people came to me and they talked about their mortgage as a weight around their neck. I started hearing that again last year for the first time in a quarter of a century. And you know what? We're going to hear it again and again and again. So be in a position where you can pay down debt. Again, to specifically answer your question, if someone is in precarious finances and if, as I believe, people are not going to make money out of property for a long time, then I think individuals should think very, very carefully about why they're working to pay their banker and their taxman. So moving on to savings products, they should certainly pay into pensions. I use the word pay because it feels like a payment. But again, the taxman's going to help them and they are going to retire. They may be 25, 30 years old just now, but you know what? They are going to get to be a grey. They are going to be thankful that they're grey and they're going to need an income. They're going to need a fund. So they need to do it.
Jonathan Davis, it's been a complete pleasure talking to you. Come and see us again soon.
Be happy to.